Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of one of FumeFX 3's most powerful new features. Now, FumeFX 3 has a feature called Effectors, and most people seem to kind of not really understand or get really what they're about. And essentially what they do is allow you to test your results like smoke density or temperature or whatever velocity within your simulation. And then based on the output that it gets back, let's say if a smoke reaches a certain thickness or if it becomes close to an object, then you might be able to give it a different result. And you can adjust every single value within Fume on a more individual, more localized level. Whereas before, everything was globalized, and that was one thing that I always had a bit of a pet peeve about in terms of the structure of how FumeFX worked, was that if you wanted to have turbulence at a certain scale or even fuel expansion, things like that, they were very globalized. So if you change it for one thing, it's going to affect everything, rather than just saying, okay, well, I want this area over here that's moving too quickly to have more drag or smoke dissipation or whatever you want to set up for it. So there's a lot you can do with it, and I'm kind of hoping that once you watch this video, it'll be that kind of aha moment where everything kind of makes more sense, and you kind of really from there take advantage of FumeFX's abilities to kind of get more control out of your simulations and out of your effects. So hopefully you enjoy this, and I can't wait to see what you guys come up with.
Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay, and I'm just going to give a quick introduction to effectors in FumeFX. So, first of all, I just want to start going over a lot of Fume 3's new features and essentially just going to cover a lot of the more interesting things or really unique things about it. So to begin, I'm just going to bring up a model to start with, and we're just going to start discussing this stuff. So, I just brought this guy in. He's a little bigger than I wanted. I'm just going to set up my scene. So first I want to make sure this is film. And we'll set this up to be, let's say, 150 frames. I don't think we'll use that many. Usually I want to keep my effects pretty small. First of all, under customize unit setup, system setup, it defaults to inches. Usually most people are going to change this to centimeters, so we're metric, and it's just the standard way that most people are going to work within 3D space. Generic units, or we can go feet, whatever in here for display, but keeping this consistent is important. In this case, if I were to create a box and say that this the height of it is about 6 feet, then I'd want this guy to be a lot smaller. Now, rather than just scaling the model, I'd rather scale it properly. So I'm going to assign a X-form modifier and then scale this dude down. In fact, I might move the center just to the base. Where are we? Okay. And go to Gizmo and just scale this guy down to meet roughly 6 feet. And that just means that the XYZ is all correct. This is I'm actually deforming the mesh by doing this, and I'll just collapse that down. So that's my model there. Okay, so I'm just using this so that we have a guy built to scale. And next up, what I want to do is I'm just going to go and just create a standard FumeFX emitter. And let's make this the dimensions of this guy. I'm going to change my unit setup to generic units. It's usually how I work. And I'm just going to set my spacing to about 1. Okay, so that guy's good. Now I'm going to create an emitter. First I'm just going to go to helpers, FumeFX, object source, and we'll just add this emitter in. And go to the modify panel, add the guy. Select FumeFX, load the GUI. Alright, so first of all, simulation tab, I'm just going to disable fuel. We don't really need that. And I'm just going to set up some less than interesting values in here, just going to get some basic turbulence. Go into the object source and add my emitter. I haven't really done anything yet, and I'm just going to sim this. All I've done is added this guy as an emitter object into my scene, so at least we can see that it's all working and it's doing its thing. Now, just to make this a bit more interesting, let's do this. Let's say that we want to have this guy, and we want to have him all made of fluid. So in other words, if I were to display a frame of this, rendering tab, we'll just make this a bit more of a dark gray color. But we'll set the opacity fairly high, like 10. So we can make this guy made all of fluid. Okay, but we want it to be more like frame 0, where if I were to render this without any lights, we can kind of see it, but basically we get like a nice silhouette. You can see it's pretty accurate. Then there's a few things we need to do. First of all, what I could do is just go in here, object source. Now I could say emit smoke 5, set the temperature to 0, or actually let's leave that and just disable temperature, disable fuel. If I were to run that again, it's still going to move out a little bit because we have the extra value here which pushes it out. If I were to set this really high, it's going to explode. It's going to use the normals as reference to how to shoot out. So suddenly this guy is looking a bit weird. Okay, so setting that to 0 means that nothing is really going to move. We don't have any temperature to actually drive it. And the only thing really going to give it any movement is going to be the turbulence. So again, turn that off. There's still going to be a subtle movement to it, and that is just, you know, how it works. It's smoke coming off of an object. But for the most part, it's going to be pretty static and still. Okay, and there are ways we could even enforce it more, but, you know, essentially this is a way that we could create a very static mesh of fluid. I'm just going to go ahead while this is simming and just add a light into my shot. Just so I can see this better. Go to the modify panel. I'm rendering V-rays, so turn shadows on, change this to V-ray shadow. Shadow parameters, I'm going to turn on atmosphere shadow. Lastly, go into illumination and add in my light and hide my light. Alright, so I did this pretty quick, but the whole point is that I assume everyone knows how to add a light to Fume at this point. So, going back, there is some slight motion to it, but for the most part it's pretty good. I'm going to turn these on and go to preview, use GPU, and now where it's GPU based we can use shadows, and we see self-shadowing the viewport. Probably one of the coolest features in a way of Fume 3. But it means also we can see a bit more of what's going on, and for the most part it is pretty still, considering. We could add drag and other things to it to really make it static, but you know, everything's good at this point. So that's 0 as well. Okay, so the idea is that we have this fully set up guy. Now, I'm going to use effectors to actually control this a bit more. And what effectors are ways to essentially control Fume. One of the big downfalls of FumeFX is that all the controls for everything are set up inside of this one environment. So you have emitters and you can control like what an emitter does per object, but if you want to have like this area be fire and this area be bad example, but if you wanted this to have like very large scale flames coming off of it and very small scale on his briefcase, something that's a bit more controlled inside of here, then that's something that you can't do technically, or at least previously couldn't. Now with effectors you get a bit more control and you're able to actually specify a lot more based on different patterns. I still would love to see this go node based, or at least be a bit more like real flow where you can set things up to have a relationship. But ultimately if we wanted to have like this character and have it so he's made of smoke but then he blows away, let's say, which is a bit more interesting. What we would do here is I'll go into an effector, same place I get my emitter from, create the effector, and let's just do this. Let's go to the object source and add the effector in. And let's just select the effector, and we'll change this to be a box. And we can change the dimensions a little bit. And I'm just going to animate this guy moving through. Okay, moving through him. Okay, pretty straightforward. In fact, I'll move it closer so it moves through slower. But the idea is that it passes right through him. Now, right now the effector doesn't actually do anything. If we were to sim this, nothing would happen. I'm going to change my spacing a little bit so this is a bit quicker to sim, but essentially nothing is going to happen. The effector doesn't do anything. However, if you'll see here, it has all this information. So this is test, which means it's going to test these values. So I could say if this is more useful for later, but if a temperature got to a certain temperature, it would then spawn an additional effect that we wanted, or whatever we wanted to do. I want to keep this pretty simple. I'm going to say, let's just make this change the temperature. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this temp. So this channel I just created is called temp, T-E-M-P. Okay, and that's all I'm going to do at this point is set that up. Now, in the simulation panel here, I'm going to go down to temperature. I'm going to set the buoyancy to 0. Okay. Jumping ahead a little bit, I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn my effector off. It's not going to do anything yet. However, I'm going to go back to my emitter and set the temperature here to set. And it's going to be set to 300. Now, essentially what's going to happen is that this has a set temperature, and if I were, like right now it's not doing anything, but if I were to set the temperature buoyancy to 1, like it defaults to, everything is going to begin to rise up. In other words, this is how, by default, when you set up Fume, it's going to have smoke rising up off the object. So that looks completely normal. Okay, this is exactly what would happen when I first choose my emitter. It's going to rise up off of him. And that is because my temperature is set to 300. So let's set this to negative 150 or negative 200. Okay? I'm going to set free flow on as well. And that way it's just going to kind of ignore the geometry and just continue to fall. So suddenly we have this frost or whatever smoke emitting off the object and falling down. Okay? Now here's the thing. I'm going to go and turn my effector on. Again, not doing anything yet, but I'm going to turn it back on. Now, what I want to do is I actually want the temperature to be turned off, like it was before, where it's completely static, like these later frames. And then only turn on if this effector moves through it. That's going to be the difficult thing. I want to essentially control that if the temperature is in the boundaries of, or if the smoke is within the boundaries of this effector, then to turn on. In other words, then to change the value. So the way I'm going to do that is I've got my effector, and we have the temperature set to negative 200. So right now the smoke is going to fall. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the simulation tab, scroll over and set the temperature buoyancy to 0, which means that no matter what the temperature is, it's not going to fall, it's not going to rise, it's not going to do anything because the buoyancy is set at 0, so it's just going to sit there. It doesn't know what to do with this temperature. So technically this is hot, or cold, it's a value of negative 200, but it doesn't know what to do with that. Okay, so what I'll do next is I want to change this. I want to say, okay, well, if the temperature buoyancy is 0, when the effector passes through it, then to change the value to 1. In other words, to make it fall and do what it should be doing. The way I'm going to do that is there's this little checkbox here. I'm going to right click and choose enable, and then I'm going to click on it, and it says answer your channel. So in other words, I can plug in this effector into this channel. So click the dot 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 and choose temp, T-E-M-P, that we specified, and hit OK. Now nothing has changed. Basically it's saying though is that this value is set as 0, however it's going to look for the effector, and if the effector is moving through it, then it's going to look at, okay, well, what what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do with this one value? Okay, so if we go back to object source and go to effector, and actually one last thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to animate my smoke to animate down to 0. I'm going to change this to add, and that just means that when we sim this, it's going to create smoke for the first few frames and then do nothing. So in other words, like if the smoke was to be knocked away or whatever, there's nothing behind it. It's not consistently or constantly emitting. So no big deal. I just want to do that quickly. Now, what we can do next is with the effector, I'm just going to have it pass through the object. So the way to do this and change the value is that right now we have the channel TMP is not doing anything. However, what I can do, and if we don't have any tests, we don't have to, it'll just say if it's inside of this boundary, then to actually do something. And I could say, alright, well, what I want to do is I want to replace the value with a scalar value of 1. If it, depending what it is, color or whatever, I can change these values, but it's a scalar value, so a value to 1. And all it's going to do is when this moves through the smoke, it will change the value of the buoyancy here from 0, that if it goes inside of this boundary, it'll change the value to 1. And because the temperature is negative 200, that will cause it to fall. So really cool. Right away, nothing yet, and it should be starting to pass through it. Alright, it's passing through it, and we can see it's beginning to move down. Now let's go back and we'll change, either we could do it here, set it to like 3, and that way it's going to be multiplied even higher. And we can see now it's really kind of happening a lot quicker. I'm going to do another thing now. A couple of things. I'm going to make this move a little slower, so we'll move this up to 100, so that way it's very slow. I'm going to set my time scale to maybe 1.9, and that way it's going to be a bit quicker to react. Now, I'm also going to do another thing. I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm just gonna duplicate it there. Go back in, add in this new effector, and this new one, I'm gonna change this to turb. Okay, so what we're doing is we're gonna tell it to have a different channel name, and in the sim tab, I'm gonna expose the turbulence. So right click, enable, and notice by the way this is XYZ. Okay, they're locked, but they are still a XYZ value, 0.3 value. Okay, I'm going to click this, and I'm going to change this to turb. So that way now I can affect the turbulence as the second one moves through it. So go back here, I'm going to set this to 1, 1, 1. In other words, it's going to have turbulence now as it goes through the second effector. So don't worry about the scaler, it doesn't do anything. We're using these 0.3 values. But it means suddenly we have turbulence as well pushing through it as the stuff begins to fall. And as it moves through, maybe I'll set the scale a bit higher. I'll go back to my emitter, set the source to maybe something a lot higher, like negative 1000, which is pretty ridiculous. So what's going to happen now is temperature moves through. As it moves through, it's going to cause him to blow away. So you get this more linear effect, okay? And suddenly he is falling away as it passes. So let's play that back. Suddenly we get this character move through and cave away. Now let's just make these a little bit bigger, so that way we have a bit more playroom, and then move them back a bit. And it just means that when they do pass over him, they'll be constantly moving down. Okay. The next thing I'll do is go to the simulation tab, and I'm going to change this to just collide within the container, so that way it'll kick around more. Alright. Let's run this again. And now we can get this guy kind of like turning to ash or something and falling apart. And technically you could do something like this without effectors by just doing multiple particle systems. However, I kind of want to avoid that. I want to make this a bit more interesting in how we go about it. And so I like the outcome. We get this nice plumey effect. So I'll just sim that. Here we go again. Alright. And again. So pretty straightforward, but now just having these two effectors move through it, when it tests inside of there, it begins to cause it to essentially affect the turbulence and the temperature, which is really good. Now, if we really wanted, we could go further with this just for fun. And we could say that if it hits the ground here to settle. And I'm not sure how this will look, but let's add this in. And we'll call this one drag. And I'm just going to set the scale at a 0.5, because velocity drag is pretty, or velocity dampening is pretty sensitive. Go to the simulation tab, and let's just add in velocity dampening. Enable that, select it, choose drag, and we're setting to 0 to start with. And then when it comes in this area, it's going to lag behind. So as this begins to fall down, we can already see it kind of like stops prematurely. If I was to pause this, maybe if I was to cancel this, you can see that as this comes down, it instantly kind of stops, which means that it's a little strong. So let's maybe set this to 0.1, which is still very strong. And the idea was just that we could tell it to kind of settle a bit, so that way it's not going to like plume out and rise up as much. It's going to kind of settle on the ground a bit more. And I don't really like how drag works. It makes it a bit kind of ugly and not too defined, but I just figured it might be interesting in this exercise to kind of have that effect. And last thing I might do is, let's just, instead of there being a floor, let's go below the floor a little bit. I'm going to add in some geometry. And that way we just have some geo here, and I'm going to add that geo in at the very bottom. Well, anyway, so what I'll do is I'll make the solid and I'll make the speed multiplier 0. And that's just another way for me to prevent it from rolling around too much. I'm kind of giving it a bit of friction on the ground. It's still going to roll over itself, so it won't entirely fix that up, but I'm just looking at ways to kind of settle this down a little bit. And that's another thing I could do if I really wanted, is that rather than this be a drag, this one here, instead we could call it smoke kill. Okay? Technically, if we go back here, oops, not to that, to velocity dampen, it's still pointing to drag, so we can disable that. And rather than that, we'll set the smoke dissipation here from 3, change this to smoke kill, and we'll set this to 20. And that's just going to help the smoke want to die away when it reaches the ground. Lastly, I'm just going to go to smoke dissipation. Whoops, I did the temperature dissipation. Turn that off. Do it to smoke dissipation, smoke kill, and we'll set this a bit higher as well to 0.8. Now it just means that as the smoke comes down onto the ground, it's going to want to tell the smoke to begin to die out a little bit, and it won't entirely kill it, but it will kind of help it dissipate a lot more. So it's not as thick, it begins to kind of die away. And we can make this happen a bit earlier by moving it up more. And smoke kill. Replace the value with even higher value if we wanted. But ideally that will help kind of get rid of the smoke. And again, we need to set the smoke dissipation as well, which is something important to keep in mind, because the dissipation strength won't affect it until it gets to that level. So if we really wanted, we could set this to 2.2, or even go higher if we wanted to. If we wanted to go higher, I'd probably recommend setting that up to be in the effector as well, because we don't want to affect it till it actually hits the ground. But this way we're getting it to kind of collapse down into the floor. Maybe it's a little too high. So value of 2 seems to be pretty good. Now, here's the one last pitfall. We can see that right away that there's this effector here. It does affect it. As soon as it goes in here, it affects it. It has this very defined line. So rather than replacing the value, what we could do is multiply the value. So the value starts at 3. We could say, okay, well, we want to multiply it by 5. And that's going to be 15, I think. So we could say multiply by 20 is 60, so let's say 15. Oh, sorry, 20 is not 60. Actually, yeah, it is. So, alright, so when we do that, it's going to multiply the value, or we could, add to it if we wanted. Rather than replacing it, essentially we could, allow it to, to blend in a bit better. And there's other things we could do here, not the radial multiplier, but other things to kind of help with that. So there's, there's essentially a few things we could do to kind of help control it from being too defined. And lastly, another way we could do that is we could actually sample the velocity, and we could say maybe if the velocity changed very drastically, in other words, if it hit the floor, then it would affect it. And that way, rather than being as soon as it enters the container, this would allow it to have that initial impact of hitting the ground, so we don't get that defined line, but then begin to eat away at it. And there's certain things like that we could do to kind of help keep the dissipation, keep it kind of a bit lower. And again, the whole idea is that I'm not trying to kill all the smoke. I just want to control it kind of not being as strong, essentially. And it's just more kind of like to show how far we could go with this. And it's still a little bit defined, but it's for the most part pretty subtle. And I'll hide this guy so we can see it as itself. I've got a frame 0. He is very voxely, but keep in mind that we're simming at a very low resolution. And again, there is more we can do with this, such as shape fall off, and that can help as well. So I'm just trying to go through a few options here you have to kind of like help it from being too much of a harsh thing. And by adjusting the fall off, just kind of helps get it a bit more subtle. And we'll set the scale down a little bit. So anyway, those are there just to kind of keep in mind, but the whole idea is that this way I can have this guy collapsing down, creating a lot of smoke. And even when it gets in here, I could kind of settle the temperature a little bit. So that's another thing you could do instead, is rather than just smoke dissipation, I could have another one lastly, which slightly bigger. So I'm going to make that unique. I accidentally instanced it. And this one Alright, so we're going to call this one settle. And what I'll do here is I'm going to go into there's a lot of things we could do with this. If I really wanted to control things a bit more, I could actually just plug this into smoke buoyancy, and that way it's going to counteract things a little bit. So I could set that to 0. And that way I'm able to affect the temperature twice in a way, which is a bit of a workaround. And we'll just say replace or blend, let's say, blend between the two or something. Set that to negative, we'll set this to 0, this to -1. Sorry, just go back, change this to settle, and I'm going to say replace. So by now you should get a pretty good idea as to like ways you can kind of control this to do some pretty interesting things. And I'm just going to do a higher resolution sim at this point. I'm going to do a larger bounding box just for a start, but then I'm going to do a higher res sim, and we can see what the final result is. But again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You can do a lot with effectors, and it allows you to specifically control values based on different things. So moving forward, I could do a lot more with this based on if, you know, let's say you have particles that move a little bit too quickly, then you could say, okay, well, then I want this to settle down a bit more and cap it there or even kill it. You can kill very specific areas that you don't like. Whatever you want it to do, you're going to have a lot more control. And even your inputs, you can input pretty much anything from that. So in fact, the last one I'll do is just towards the end there. I don't really like how much it's kind of pluming out, so let's just help with that. I'm going to go helpers, affector, I'll make this, yeah, cylinder. Put it around the guy. And I'll make this one a drag one just like we did before. Drag. And we'll make this effector distance, and rather than 1 to 0, say 0 to 1. And we'll keep that value of 5 for the time being, just to test it, see if it's working. Enable, and we reassign drag. And let's just see what happens here. And so lastly, I changed to replace and run sim. The one thing is when I do that, everything falls and we can see it's all working. So at this stage I want to set this to a bit higher. And this might be too high, but the idea is that we don't want to affect it unless it's within this range from minimum to maximum. So hopefully this means it's going to ignore it until it gets to a certain distance. Alright, so the thing's still simulating, but it's about 71 frames in. So here's just like a bit of a higher res version of the guy. And we'll scrub through, and as we can see, we can begin to see it falling apart. and pluming out all over the ground. So that's the sort of thing I always want to talk about, is just having the effector push through and pull apart the character, or whatever we want to do, so that way we're essentially having it melt or fall apart, and having complete control when we do it. So hopefully that kind of like opens up your mind into things you can do with this approach, and I'll definitely follow up with more stuff down the line, but I thought this would be pretty interesting to check out. And lastly, I just remembered, a friend of mine, Johnny Rand, put up a tutorial on Vimeo. So if you look for, or just look for really John Rand, should come up with it. And so while I was playing around with this recently for a film project, and that's where it kind of gave me the idea to kind of talk about the stuff, he actually put something up around the same time as well, which looks pretty damn cool. I haven't had a chance to look through it yet, but it definitely looks like it's different stuff to what I'm covering here. And again, just it's good to have a different person's perspective on this sort of thing, so I definitely recommend checking it out. And there should be additional info on this subject, and I'll definitely put up some more stuff soon. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can email me at this email address here, or you can visit my website here. And so I've got plenty of other tutorials, probably like 30, 40, or 50 on there at least, and I'll be putting up lots more FumeFX content amongst other things very soon as well. So hopefully you found this informative, and I'll definitely put out some more stuff soon. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully you found that informative. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, or you can visit my website where I have plenty more tutorials and other information. And my website is allanmckay.com. Okay, thanks again.